I would like to introduce to all of you today the keynote for DOYO Live in 2018, Mr. Allen Gannett.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, hey guys. How are you? I had one of those donuts this morning, and I'm like, oh, I'm so happy. So we're gonna have fun. I'm your first speaker of the morning, so no pressure. They let me out of middle school to be here, which I appreciate. I need a permission slip later. But we're gonna be talking about creativity, and I just had a book come out now a month and a half ago, all about the creative process. And so I'm gonna be sharing with you guys some of the research from that book, some of the findings, giving you sort of a little sneak peek. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to send me an email. There we go, there's a giant picture of my face. You can feel free to LinkedIn me, social media, all those things. I've been giving this talk for a few weeks now as part of the book tour and giving out my email, and I was surprised the amount of drunk emails I've received, so don't be that person. It's very weird at 2 a.m. So we're gonna be talking all about creativity, and creativity is one of these words that we all think we know what it means, right? Like, oh, creativity, I read about that in Fast Company, or I've read a book about that. But in reality, there's something actually more difficult at work, right? When you think about creativity, well, how come when I throw paint on a canvas, it's not creative, but when Jackson Pollock did, it was, right? Like, what's going on there? Well, it turns out when you start investigating creativity, there's something richer at work. There's a timing element, there's a social context element, and there's some people in our culture who are just so darn good at it, right? The creative geniuses who hit after hit, book after book, discovery after discovery, seem to be able to do no wrong when it comes to creativity. So who are some people here you think of when I say creative genius? Just yell it out.
Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Great one. Good start. The Kardashians. I like it. Who else? Spielberg. Okay. Kanye. Controversy. None of you said Beyonce. That's a problem. So when you think of creativity, it's very intertwined with the concept of creative genius, and these are the answers I get the most. None of you said Einstein. Come on, guys. We have Einstein, Picasso, Elon Musk, Oprah. On the top right, we have Mozart, our sort of prototypical child genius. On the bottom right, we have Beethoven looking super creepy. When I give this talk, no one mentions my personal favorite, which is Taylor Swift, but that's okay. You guys have flaws, she doesn't. So what's interesting to me about creativity is that it's so intertwined with the individuals who practice it. It's very hard in our culture to talk about creative genius and creativity as completely separate phenomenons. But something is interesting. When you look at the stories of creative genius, how they've come up with these big ideas, they all follow a similar archetype. So let me give you an example. Paul McCartney is the #1 songwriter of #1 singles, including the #1 most recorded song of all time, Yesterday. And what's interesting to me is when you hear the story of how he came up with the song Yesterday, he literally says he just woke up with it. He said in an interview, "I woke up one morning with a tune in my head and thought, hey, I don't know this tune, or do I?" That's crazy. This melody that went on to literally be the most recorded song in history just hit him in a sleepy morning. In fact, he was so worried about this that maybe he had accidentally plagiarized it, that he went around for weeks asking his friends and was like, have you heard this before? And they're like, no, Paul. He's like, are you sure? And they're like, yes. He's like, okay. And as a little historical side note and some trivia for you, he only dreamed up the melody. So he used these placeholder lyrics when he was singing it to his friends. This is true. You can Google it. And I will sing it for you if you promise to applause. Is that a yes? Okay. Scrambled eggs, oh my baby, how I love your eggs. Diddle-diddle, I believe in scrambled eggs. Thank you. Ohio's Got Talent. So what's interesting about these stories of creative genius is that over and over again you find that they have these moments These lightning bolts, these flashes of genius, whether it's Paul McCartney waking up with the idea for Yesterday, J.K. Rowling being hit with the idea for Harry Potter on a train, this is the way we talk about creativity. It all comes down to this flash. And this is part of what I call the inspiration theory of creativity. This is the way that we think of creativity in our culture and Western culture. And there's 4 key elements. One, it's individual-centric. Right? We talk about the Kanye West, the Steve Jobs, the Elon Musk, the Taylor Swift. It's about the individual. Second, for these people, it's easy, right? They're not struggling to create, they literally wake up with it. Third, this is overwhelming, right? We literally use an electricity analogy, but we talk about getting into the flow, talk about being inspired. And fourth and finally, these people are all a little bit weird. They're like manic, neurotic, you know, Steve Jobs is a jerk, Elon Musk is a bad dad, blah, blah, blah. But there's also a 5th element. It's also something that's unattainable, right? It's also the story of the haves and the have-nots. It's a story of the people who are born with this sort of divine creative talent and the rest of us normies who are just trying to create our next tweet. Adobe did a study and they found that only 25% of us say we're living up to our creative potential. And this is, I think, a really good time for our token picture of a sad puppy. Yeah. I actually have a corgi. This is not my corgi because my corgi is never sad. Just saying. So this idea we have of creativity is pretty depressing, right? It's the story of, well, I hope our kids are born with it. But what I investigated in the book is I wanted to understand, is this really true? Is this really how creativity works? And so in the book what I did is I look at it from a historical angle, so looking at some of the stories we all think we know about creativity. I look at it from an academic angle, what does science and research tell us about creativity? And I did about 25 field interviews with modern day creative geniuses. This is everyone from the team behind La La Land and Dear Evan Hansen, Michelin star chefs, billionaires like David Rubenstein, and want to understand from their perspective, how does creativity develop? And so I want to give you a little slice of what I found. I want to start by talking about some of the history around creativity. See, we have these stories of creative genius, like the stories of Paul McCartney. And what's most interesting to me is how BS these are. So Mozart's a great example. Who here has seen the movie Amadeus? Raise your hand. Okay, that's like half the room. So for those of you who haven't, you should. Amadeus won 8 Academy Awards. It did $220 million in the box office. That's $660 million inflation adjusted. And by the way, I was giving this talk in Toronto a few weeks ago, and I then made a joke because I couldn't help myself. I was like, that's like $1 billion Canadian, and they got really offended. So don't make currency jokes, apparently. Anyway, so in the movie, basically in the movie, the idea is that Mozart's this child prodigy. And so he literally starts the movie with he's 3 years old, blindfolded playing piano for the Pope. That's the opening scene. And the narrator is Salieri, his arch nemesis, who's this other composer who ends up killing him, spoiler. And Salieri is narrating and he goes, Mozart, playing piano at 3 for the Pope, wrote his first concerto at 4, his first opera at 6. It was like the voice of God. He had no second drafts. And this is the notion of Mozart we have. We think of him as the prototypical child genius. In fact, when I was starting writing this book, and I was writing a book about how creativity can be learned, people are like, well, what about Mozart? Let's talk what about Mozart. So here's the real Mozart story. Ready for this? So Mozart had what we would all call, and maybe you are one, a helicopter dad. And his helicopter dad, when he was 3 years old, said, little Mozart? And little Mozart was like, yes, Dad. I love you, but, and he's like, oh my God, I want your love. And he's like, I love you, but you need to become a great musician. And as all of us know, you shouldn't give kids conditional love, or else this turns out. And Mozart said, okay, great. What do you want me to do, Dad? And Dad hired for him the best music teachers in all of Europe and made this little kid at 3 years old start practicing 3 hours, 7 days a week. Mozart did not write a piece of music at 4. He did not write a piece of music at 6. We found something we thought he wrote when he was 11. Turns out it was plagiarized. Whoops. The real first piece of music that Mozart wrote was when he was 17. And you might be like, oh, that's still pretty impressive. except for two things. One, it's not very good. You should listen to it on Spotify. Two, this was after 14 years of practicing 3 hours every single day with the best music teachers in all of Europe under the conditional love of a helicopter dad. Like, you too could write a half-decent concerto. Oh, and by the way, his name wasn't even Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. That was a stage name. His real name was this. He thought it was too long. He's probably right. And the idea that he would never compose second drafts comes from a letter that was published in 1815 in a music magazine that Mozart wrote describing his composition process. That letter, literally #fake news. The music magazine publishers made it up to sell more copies. So Mozart is actually probably the best example of the historical game of telephone that goes on when we talk about these stories of creatives. We all like the idea of a hero, and there's a lot of incentive behind popularizing those stories. So that's what happens when you look at the history of it. But when you look at the actual academic research behind creativity, you see the same thing. See, we've been studying creativity across psychology, neuroscience, sociology, anthropology. We actually know a lot about how creativity works. And what you find is that the research does not support the idea of the inspiration theory of creativity. Let me give you one example. So during this talk, we're going to go on a few international trips together, so I hope you have some airline miles. So we're going to first go to Austria, Sound of Music Land. And in Sound of Music Land, some professors had this idea for an experiment. Okay, if creativity and genius are intertwined, well then what would happen if we had people do both a creativity test and an IQ test? They should be correlated. The higher your IQ, the more creative you should be. And so IQ is normalized on a bell curve. So if you have an IQ of 100, about half the world is smarter than you, half the world is less smart, right? So everyone here has an IQ over 100 because you came to DOYO. I'll take the $5 later. And here's what they found. When they had people do this test, they found that there actually was a correlation, but only up to an IQ of 104. Once you get to a threshold of 104, the correlation between creativity and IQ goes away. The problem, an IQ of 104, that's like billions of people. That's not a dozen people generation, that's not 100 people, that's not 1,000 people. That's everyone here, and that's billions and billions of other people who all have the same creative potential. This is called the threshold theory. It's been replicated in a lot of studies. It's this idea that above a relatively average IQ threshold, we all have the same creative potential. So the question for me is, why is there such a gap? Why is there a gap between creative potential and creative achievement? If we all have this potential, well then how can we unlock it? So I want to talk about a couple things you can do to help unlock it. There's a lot more in the book. But to start, I'm going to take us on a little adventure to Phoenix, Arizona. Maybe you'll retire there. And in Phoenix, Arizona, we're going to go somewhere which seems a little bit weird to talk about creativity. We're going to go, and I had to Google what this was because I didn't really understand it, to something called a video rental store. It's like an offline Netflix, so you like walk around the shelves instead of browsing menus. I don't know why you're laughing. Anyway, at this weird offline Netflix thing, the protagonist of our story was actually the clerk at this video rental store. His name was Ted. And Ted is an 18-year-old community college student. This is not Ted. Ted does not have a full-grown beard. This is the only image I could find on Google Photos. And what's interesting, though, about Ted and why he's useful for this story is that for some reason, Ted, this 18-year-old kid, had amazing taste. Every day, 5 or 6 o'clock, when people came home from work, they would line up and wait to talk to Ted because they all wanted his movie recommendations. You know, they were like, hey, I like Woody Allen. He's like, how about Albert Brooks? I like this action movie. He was like, how about that action movie? Ted, this 18-year-old kid, was like this film sommelier. He knew movies. Where did this come from? Well, like many things, it's kind of Freudian. So Ted was the first of 5 children to teenage parents. Well, they didn't have them all when they were teenagers. He had teenage parents. They proceeded to have 4 more children. And they were kind of poor. They lived in this 2-bedroom house in the suburbs of Phoenix. And it was always chaotic. And so to get away, he would go escape to his grandmother's house. And this is what you get in Shutterstock when you buy a photo of grandmother's living room. And this story takes place in 1985, not 1965, so give me some slack. And he would go to his grandmother's house to get away from it all. And his grandmother was one of these old ladies who just loved Hollywood. She always had the TV on, she was always watching movies, she had all the Star magazines sort of strewn across the coffee table, and she would talk about actors and actresses with their first names, like they were former lovers and flames. And for Ted, this became his safe space. Wrapped up in Hollywood, wrapped up in entertainment, he could go here and get away. And so he fell in love with movies. And so when the second ever video rental store opened in the suburbs of Phoenix, he walked in and started talking to the owner. The owner was like, damn, this kid's weird. And he got a job as a clerk. Now, video rental stores, apparently, were empty during the day because people have jobs and they're going to rent movies on the way home from work, not during the day. And so Ted was sitting there, and he probably should have been studying to get into Arizona State, but instead he decided that, oh, well, I love movies. Look at all these movies. He decided that he was going to watch every single video in the store. And I don't mean that, I'm not being hyperbolic, I'm not making a dramatic point. There were less movies back then, but he literally decided he was going to watch every single video in the store. And this consumption became hugely valuable for him. He essentially absorbed the entire sort of corpus of LA. And from that, he developed this amazing ability to know what people would like, what was out there, what was similar, what was different. He developed taste. And this has treated him pretty well. In 2000, he was recruited to become the chief content officer of Netflix, where for the last 18 years, he's overseen all original programming, all content licensing. This year, they're spending $7 billion with a B on original content, and they're producing 700 original shows, not episodes, shows. And he's one of the people I interviewed for the book, and what was interesting is that a huge part of what he credits his creative achievement to is actually consumption. See, this is one of the patterns I found early on in my research. We talk about consumers and creatives almost in opposition to each other. Like, you've probably seen that really annoying social media meme that's like, 90% of people consume, 9% engage, 1% create, hashtag hustle, hashtag Gary V. And it's not only stupid, it's actually wrong. See, one of the things I found that was so vivid is when you actually talk to creative achievers, they all have this experience of intense amounts of consumption. J.K. Rowling, in an interview with the New York Times, was asked, well, how do you become a great writer? She says, the most important thing you can do is to read. She spent her entire childhood in a book because her parents were always fighting, so she would close the bedroom door and just read and read and read. She, in college, had library finds. She had so many books out. And across all the different industries of people I talked to, I found that consumption was this trend that appeared over and over again. But why? Why would consumption be tied to creativity? What's the mechanism at work there? And so, to tell this story, I'm going to use me as a prop this time, and I'm going to use me in 20 years. So you're going to see what I look like in 20 years. I think I aged pretty well. Great beard. And for some reason, in 20 years, I'm reading a paper newspaper. Very strange. I got it at a hipster store in Cleveland, and are Cleveland jokes funny? I don't know. And anyway, I'm going through this paper newspaper, and I stumble across something that surprisingly is actually really useful for scientists when they study creativity. And that's a crossword puzzle. Is anyone here a crossword puzzler? Raise your hand. Great, I'm going to pick on you. So crossword puzzles are actually really interesting in the study of creativity because they can be solved in two different ways. See, sometimes when you're solving a crossword puzzle, you solve it through logical processing. You're like, okay, that first letter's G, that second letter's R, I don't know what those are. The next letter's N. Oh, it's green. I solved it. This type of processing, logical processing, is what happens in the left hemisphere of our brain. So it's kind of cliche when you write a book on creativity to talk about left brain, right brain, but it actually turns out it's really important. So we're going to give a quick little snippet of it. So your left brain is where you store the dominant meanings of words, of concepts. Think about it as definition 1 in a dictionary. That's all in your left hemisphere of your brain. So like if I asked you what color the sky is, your left brain would be like, dummy, it's blue. It's also where you do logical processing. So when you're solving a math problem, it's very step by step, it's very conscious. That's all happening in the left hemisphere of our brain. But then there's another way that we solve crossword puzzles. And this happens to a lot of people here, because we're very smart. Sometimes you're looking at it and you're like, oh, it's green. I'm brilliant. I should get promoted. And sometimes you have sudden insight. And what's interesting about this is that sudden insight from a biological perspective is actually the same thing that these creative geniuses experience when they have flashes of genius or aha moments. And so what scientists do is when they want to understand more about creativity, one of the things they do is they literally put people in MRI machines and they put a little visor on them and they show them puzzles. And then they ask them, hey, how did you solve that? Was it sudden insight or was it logical processing? Then they compare the MRI results and see, well, what happened differently? So Dr. Edward Bowden is one of the big researchers in this field. His whole career is specialized around aha moments and insight. And it's one of the people I talked to for the book. And he gave me this quote, which I think is a really good sort of, just like summary of it, which is that aha moments are a normal cognitive process, but they have a surprising result. They're a normal cognitive process. Let me explain what he means. See, sudden insight happens in the right hemisphere of our brain. The right hemisphere is where we store like metaphors, related concepts, sort of like definitions 2 and 3 in the dictionary. It's also where we do, think about, for example, when you hear a joke, right? That happens in your right hemisphere. You connect the wordplay together, and all is subconscious. You're not thinking like, why is this funny, right? Unless it's Adam Sandler. So, is he from Ohio? So I want to give you another example of the difference between left brain and right brain. So think about if I asked you to visualize a worm. Your left hemisphere would think of this, right, without the creepy face. It would think of a worm. Your right hemisphere would think of sort of related concepts like a bookworm or gummy worms or those songs you can't stop thinking about. Earworms, yes, good. And what's interesting, though, about this is that these aha moments, these sudden insights that happen in your right hemisphere, well, they're not actually special. They're just simply subconscious. See, the analogy I like to really focus on is think about the idea of like a quiet lab partner and a loud lab partner in college. Your left hemisphere is that loud lab partner. He was that guy who was smart, but he's also the captain of the lacrosse team. He just talks too much. And he was like, okay, we're going to do this, and then this, and then this, and look, we solved it. And you're like, okay. And then your right hemisphere is that quiet lab partner who's like sort of mumbling in the corner, and they're working on the problem, and only once they get the solution do they sort of chirp up and say, hey, I got it. And what's interesting, though, is that if your loud lab partner, if your left hemisphere is too active, if it's too loud, you can't hear what's been going on in your right hemisphere. What's been going on with your quiet lab partner. And so this is why you experience aha moments like in the shower, on a run, or in a commute. It's not that your shower is inspiring or that your commute is inspiring, although if your boss is here, let's say it is. But it's not that your commute is inspiring. It's that simply those are moments in your left hemisphere doesn't have a lot going on. You can hear what's been going on in your right hemisphere. This is why we talk about like drugs and alcohol being correlated with creativity. It just are things that depress your left hemisphere. Right? So you don't have to like do drugs, you can go on a run. So other than going on a run, how can you make these aha moments happen more? Well, this is where it got really interesting. So when I was talking to academics about this, they're like, oh, well, there's one thing that is super correlated to having more aha moments. And Bowden summarizes it in a quote he gave me, which in the book I have twice, and I bolded it the second time. My copy editor was like, you can't do that. And I was like, yes, I can. And she was like, no, you can. And I was like, yes, I can. And it's in there, so I won. And the quote is that you can't have insights about things you don't know anything about. You can't have insights about things you don't know anything about. The reason why consumption is such an important part about creativity is that if you want to connect the dots, you connect the dots you have. Paul McCartney grew up in a musical household surrounded by musical parents. He literally played in a cover band for years. So yeah, he dreams about music and you don't. J.K. Rowling spent her entire childhood in a book, so she thinks about character ideas and plots, and you don't, but they also don't think about tweets, right? So consumption has this huge role in the creative process. So for the book, I interviewed 25 modern-day creative achievers. This is everyone from Brenda Chapman, who's the first woman to win the Academy Award for Best Animated Film. She was the story director on Lion King. She was the director of Brave. I interviewed Kenya Barris, the creator of Blackish, Casey Neistat from YouTube, Alexis Ohanian from Reddit. And what I thought was so interesting was across all these industries, consumption was actually the thing I saw that was the strongest pattern. All of these people had gone through this intense phase of consumption. But what's also interesting is that it didn't actually stop. So I was interviewing Ted Sarandos from Netflix, and we're sitting in his private office. I'm on a couch. And this guy's really busy. He has a private jet. And I'm a really ditzy interviewer. And so I was like, this is my idea of a good interview question. I was like, oh, so you used to watch a lot of movies. Okay. How many movies do you watch these days? He's like, 3 to 4 hours a day. And I was like, what? He's like, 3 to 4 hours a day. I was like, huh? He's like, yeah. And I was like, oh. And so one of the things I found that I thought was so interesting was that it wasn't just that this consumption did in the beginning, but they actually continue this throughout their entire careers. And I found this same pattern, this same number over and over again, this 3 to 4 hours a day, this 5 hours a day, this 2 hours a day. This idea that these creators spend about 20% of their waking hours consuming highly niche content. They're not going out and learning a little about a lot. They're ingesting a lot about a little. They're going very, very, very deep. I call it the 20% principles. This idea that these people who've reached superstar status of success actually spend a huge amount of their time consuming other people's creative products because it gives them those raw materials. It gives them those dots to connect. Now, this is where we're going to have a dramatic pause. And I'm going to drink a sip of water because I haven't yet, and I'm thirsty. So, is anyone here from New Jersey originally? All right, me too, I'm sorry. And, if you grew up in New Jersey like us, we grow up kind of cynical because of the smog. And you're sitting back there and you're going, okay, Allen, that's great and all. I should consume a lot, but I watch a lot of Netflix. I'm not creating great screenplays. And this is a good point. The average American watches 3 hours of TV every single day, according to the Department of Labor. What gives? Why aren't we all creating great screenplays? Well, it turns out it's actually not just how much you consume, but also how you consume it. So what I want to dive into is I want to first sort of take a step back. So before we talk about how you should consume, I want to go back to creativity as a concept. When I started, I said it's kind of hard to define, right? You sort of know it when you see it, oh, that's creative, but Allen's version of that is not creative. Well, academics actually have a really cool definition of creativity, and are things that are both novel and valuable. Novel and valuable. And the and is really, really important because it's not just about creating things that are new. Think about this. I went into Microsoft Paint when I was working on this talk, and I created this. Definitely novel. Definitely not valuable to anyone other than my mother. But then I also went and said, by the way, this is true. I recently learned how to do conditional color formatting in Excel. Amazing. Definitely valuable, definitely not novel, definitely not creative. And so when we talk about creativity, what sociologists call creativity is the ability to create things that are both novel and valuable. And therein lies a problem. Because as my friends from New Jersey will quickly point out, value is a social construct, right? The things we deem are valuable are things we all agree are valuable, right? Money. We have to say something's valuable for it to be valuable. And so if we want to understand more about this, we have to really get into the social phenomenon behind how people perceive their preference and their values. And one of the things we can do to do this is actually look at something kind of surprising. We can actually look at hits. And I don't mean hits in this sort of Taylor Swift sense, although those count too. But any time that a group of people, large or small, say that something's both novel and valuable, we call it a hit. There can be a hit paper at an academic conference. There can be a hit tweet. There can be something that's a hit among the fine art critics in New York. So hits are actually a really useful construct for sociologists to understand how creativity works and how, as people, we decide what we like and dislike. And so we're going to talk a little bit about hits. And to do that, I'm going to do a little experiment. But first, is anyone here named Lisa? Okay, great. No Lisas. I don't have a thing against Lisas. It's just helpful. So I want you all to name some famous Lisas. I just want you to yell it out. Lisa Loeb. Lisa Kudrow. Lisa, don't be that person. Lisa Leslie. No one else? Well, these are the most common answers I get, so you guys get like a 25%. Lisa Marie Presley, Lisa Kudrow, Lisa Lampanelli, Lisa Bonet. These are the common answers I get. Now, what do all four of these women have in common? And don't be that guy who says they're famous, their name's Lisa, or that they're women, or that they're actresses. What do they all have in common? So, all of these women were born in the 1960s. Lisa was the #1 name for every single year of the 1960s except for 2. It was the hit name of the decade. But then something happened. According to the Social Security Administration, by 2016, Lisa had fallen to the 833rd most popular name. There were only 342 baby girls in the entire country named Lisa. The New York Times literally published an article titled, "Where Have All the Lisas Gone?" This is a chart of SSA data of the popularity of Lisa over time. It's not good. And so what's interesting to us when you talk about hits is that they have both a rise and a fall. And so I want to talk about both the rise and the fall separately. Let's start with the rise. So to do this, we're going to get our airline miles out again. And this time we're going to go to China. If anyone here speaks Mandarin, you cannot help with this, okay? So we're going to do a little experiment from a famous psychology study. We're going to look at this Chinese character. And again, if you speak Mandarin, poker face. So look at this. And the question that I have for you is, do you think this Chinese character has a positive meaning or a negative meaning? Okay? Positive meaning or a negative meaning? So if you think it has a positive meaning, raise your hand. 80%? We're in the Midwest? Okay. Negative? 20%? Very optimistic bunch. Well, I have something to tell you. I tricked you. It means nothing. So this is from a famous psychology study by a guy named Robert Zionk, who you've probably heard of if you've ever taken a Psych 101 class. And basically, he had this question, which is, what drives human preference? And one of his hypotheses was that I bet you if you show people something more times, it probably affects how much they like it. And so he had this idea, let's take a made-up thing that don't mean anything, and let's show them to people at different rates. We'll show them to some people 5 times, 15 times, 25 times. And then we'll ask them how positive or negative do they think it is, and how much do they like or dislike it. And what he found was the more you see something, the more you like it. Merely being exposed to something made you like it more in almost a linear fashion. He called it, because he's not a very good marketer, the mere exposure effect. And this has huge implications for us as marketers, right? This is why we have logos and brand colors and all these things, because we know that having something be familiar makes people like it more. But why? Well, it goes back to evolutionary biology, where it turns out that as humans, one of the things we're wired for is we're wired to seek out the familiar. And the reason why is that our brain is constantly trying to keep us safe, and we've realized that things that are unfamiliar, they could harm us. Like imagine you were for some reason in a random house in the basement, like you broke in, and you see this random door. You're like, I'm not going in that creepy door. I could die. I don't have life insurance. My kids need to go to college. But now imagine that same door was in your grandmother's house, and it's where she stored the wine. You're like, I love that door. That door's great. And so our brain uses familiarity as a way to assess whether or not something is safe. And as a result, we crave the familiar. It feels comfortable to us. It feels cozy. So another role that consumption plays is that, well, as creatives, we also have to create things that have a level of familiarity. In order to do that, you have to know what's already out there. Okay. But if the more we see something, the more we like it, then why aren't we all living in Lisa land? Why aren't we all named Lisa? Shouldn't Lisa just keep going up in popularity forever? Shouldn't I be named Lisa? This is my favorite stock photo, by the way. They're all smiling. I don't know why. Probably because they're not named Lisa. And so why do things eventually fall from favor? Well, we're going to go to another study by Robert Zionk. He's not going to trick you again. And this time Robert Zionk said, okay, what if we take something more complex? What if we take something like an abstract piece of art, and instead of just flashing it, let's have people actually study it. And he did the same thing. He showed it to some people once, 3 times, 6 times. And what he found was that when you take something a little bit more complex, you have people actually spend some time with it, there's actually a different effect. This time what you find is that at first, the more you see it, the more you like it, but then eventually, you start to get bored of it. You start to seek out novelty. You want new things. And so this is interesting. It turns out as humans, we also have this other urge, this pursuit of the novel. We like going to new restaurants. We like trying new things. And again, it comes back to biology where as humans, when we were originally hunter-gatherers and we were looking for that next meal, the next source of reward, we were in a random field and we saw some weird tiny strawberry. We're like, oh, calories. I like calories. I'm going to eat this. So as humans, we're wired to also seek out the novel. Now, this is literally a contradiction, right? We both want the familiar for safety, but we also seek out the novel for potential reward. Does not compute, right? That doesn't make any sense. Those are direct opposites. Well, it turns out that this contradiction is actually our brain's really elegant way of balancing risk and reward. We actually don't like things that are too new. So for example, if you saw this weird berry thing, you'd be like, I'm not eating that weird red olive. Like, that's strange. Which is good, because it's a U seed. It will kill you. And so it actually turns out the result is we like things that are familiar enough to feel safe, but still novel enough to be interesting. And what you find is that there's this effect, and psychologists call it the inverted U-shaped relationship between familiarity and preference, which I've rebranded the creative curve because #marketing. And that would be a terrible book title. And basically what you find is that there's all these studies that over and over again find that when you look at an individual, a group, or a population, when you compare familiarity to preference, when you're first exposed to something, you like it more and more, then eventually you get bored and you like it less and less. So think about the first time you heard that new Drake song, Nice for What? The first time you're like, this is terrible. The third time you're like, oh, nice for this. Yeah, I like this. And the 10th time you're like, I like it, but please stop. And the 15th time you're like, oh my God, Drake, what is this? And in the book, I break this up into 5 categories that I think are really, really important to understand as marketers. See, when an idea is too new, when it's not familiar enough, it just appeals to fringe audiences. So think about like your goths, your hipsters. If you watched Men's Fashion Week this year, for example, you would have seen that the big trend among men's designers was these big unstructured coats, which like none of you are wearing, and you're like, that's weird. But in like 5 years, you're all going to be wearing them because that's how trends work. But then ideas reach what I call the sweet spot of the creative curve, and this is actually the most important part of the entire presentation. So for those of you who've been sleeping, like wake up. So basically what happens is at a certain stage, ideas go very quickly from low preference to high preference with just a little bit of additional familiarity. They're familiar enough to feel safe, but novel enough to drive interest. Your job as a marketer is actually to create ideas in this spot. When we talk about creative genius, what we're really talking about is the fact that some people are really good at over and over again creating ideas that are this balance of the familiar and the new. So to give you a good example of this, right now there's this big trend that you may have seen on Facebook. There's some viral videos about it where in Lower Manhattan there's this little ice cream shop that has this massive line of people waiting up for it. It's actually not an ice cream shop, it's a scoopable cookie dough shop. And this is a great example of something that's in this sweet spot, pun intended, of the creative curve, where it's familiar but it's novel. It's ice cream but it's cookie dough. It's cookie dough but it's ice cream. And this thing has been blowing up. There's now a competitor in DC, a competitor in Baltimore. If you open one of these, like, it'll probably do well. But eventually, like all trends, it becomes cliche, right? It becomes Pinkberry. So eventually ideas become overexposed. And the best example of this I can give you is a mid-2000s reality TV show reference. Are you ready for it? Okay. His name's John, her name's Kate. They have 8 children. Okay, great. So in January 2009, the new season of John and Kate plus 8 came out. And not only did this mark a new era in bad television, it also marked the end of the clothing brand Ed Hardy. Because John Gosling started wearing Ed Hardy in every single episode. He was in Us Weekly and People, always wearing Ed Hardy. And Ed Hardy went from $900 million a year in sales in 2008 to now it does $27 million. Ed Hardy used to be cool. Like, there's pictures of Beyonce wearing Ed Hardy. But it became overexposed, overdistributed, to the point that C-list reality TV stars started wearing it all over TV. By the way, this is the guy who owned the Ed Hardy brand. They're both really cool. So once ideas become overexposed and cliche, then they become what I call a follow-on failure. And this is where a lot of big companies get trapped. You know, they'll see an idea while it's in the sweet spot, but by the time they come out with it, it still may be popular, but within a few months it's going to fall apart, right? And they're like, what happened? So a great example of this right now is like fidget spinners. Like, I guess they're still popular, but like, don't open a fidget spinner store, because by this holiday season, like, you're dead. And then finally, ideas eventually become out of date, where they become so overexposed, and if you want to take a photo, this is a good one to take a photo of. They become so overexposed, they become so overdone, that people aren't interested anymore, right? So think about, like, don't open like a disco record store, or don't start collecting Beanie Babies. Like, that's not a good idea. So I want to end with something. Beanie Babies. I want to end with something. You know, when we talk about creativity, what we're really talking about is creating things that are in this sweet spot of the creative curve, that have this right blend of the familiar and the novel. They're familiar enough to feel safe, but they're novel enough to be interesting and new. And before, I told you that when it comes to creativity, one of the patterns was consumption. But like I said, it's not just how much you consume, but it's actually how you consume it. And it has to do with this. So to explain this story about how you should consume, I'm going to use a character you may have heard of before, Ben Franklin. And this is a story about when Ben Franklin was 18. He was once actually young. You might not have known. He didn't always have the wig. And when Ben Franklin was 18 years old, he was actually really ashamed. And the reason why is that his father found one of the letters he wrote and was like, Ben, you're a terrible writer. And Ben was like, oh my God, I want your love. There's a pattern emerging. And he said, okay, I'm going to become a great writer. And Ben Franklin talks in his autobiography about how he decided he was going to become a great writer. And what he did was he actually decided to imitate. So he took a copy of The Spectator, which was sort of like The Economist of the time. It was a magazine. They had magazines back then. They just weren't glossy. And he took a copy of The Spectator, and he found an article he liked. And he basically turned it into sort of like a Mad Lib. He outlined its structure. Oh, did it start with a quote? Did it start with a story? Did it start with a thesis? He built an outline of its structure. He put it on the side of his desk, and he came back a week later. And he describes in his autobiography how he then came back, rewrote the article as a way to learn what is that persuasive structure. What is that familiar structure? He then made it even harder for himself. He cut up the outline. They had scissors back then, who knew? They cut up the outline, he shuffled it around his desk, he came back again a week later, and he again rewrote the article. And one of the things I found in my interviews over and over and over again was that these great creative achievers were actually incredibly comfortable with the idea of imitation. And it's not imitation in the form of plagiarism where it's let's copy the content, but it's imitating the structure of great successful works that have come before them. Kanye West just tweeted out, great artists take an update, which ironically is stealing a Steve Jobs quote, which is a great artist steal an update, which is ironically stealing a Pablo Picasso quote that's great artist steal. And what you find over and over again is that these great creatives engage in imitation. Kurt Vonnegut, for his master's thesis, he literally went out and took all these great American novels and he charted out the story arcs, the positive and negative emotional change of the stories, and he found there was 4 recurring story arcs that appeared in these great novels. And this was a foundational thing for him as a writer. Stephen King talks about in his book how he rewrote The Great Gatsby by hand to learn how to tell stories. And so you find that imitation is a huge part of the creative process of these successful creatives, and I call it the Franklin method. This idea of the observation, recreation of the structure of great successful work. And the reason why this works is that imitation allows you to learn what is that familiar baseline, right? What is, and no one wants to watch a movie that's 9 hours long with no protagonist, right? We actually really, when we talk about familiarity, the structure of creative work is a key thing that we're looking for. Because then what we can do as creatives, if we have that structure, we can then focus on that novel twist. What is that thing we're going to add to it? Harry Potter is literally the most straightforward orphan story of all time, but there's wizards. Star Wars is a Western in space. So the things that we often mistake when it comes to creativity is we think creativity is about the radical new. But actually, creativity is about creating that blend of the familiar and the novel, because that's what ultimately becomes hits. So I want to leave you with 4 points. 1 is that flashes of genius are a normal biological process that have a surprising result, right? They feel magical, they feel mystical, they aren't. It's simply how our right hemisphere processes information. 2, you can have more of them by consuming. Consumption was one of the strongest patterns I found in my interviews with creative achievers. These great creatives are some of the biggest consumers of culture. 3rd is when we talk about creativity, we're talking about ideas that are this blend of the familiar and the novel. They're familiar enough to be safe, but they're novel enough to also feel new and interesting. And finally, it's not just about how much you consume, but it's also how you consume it. And the way to consume is that these great creatives, they consume in this sort of imitation-like fashion, where either physically or in their mind, they're actually understanding what is the structure of these creative works. They're not just watching the movie, they're going, oh, that was the opening scene, that was the climax, that was the turning event. And they're using that as a way to understand what are these baselines and what are these familiar things. So I think we have time for a couple questions, but I wanted to thank you guys so much. 2 questions?
Questions? Anybody have a question for Alan? I do. Maybe I'll overstep my time. But obviously, through all this goes for Bowden. Is your interview skills with Netflix CEO? So excuse me if it doesn't have a lot of depth. All the people that you went through in your interviews through the book, the 2 or 3 that stand out the most to you, or 1 or 2 that stand out the most to you?
Yeah, good question. So these were like a really interesting set of interviews because it's a pretty eclectic set of people. And one of the patterns I found I thought was really interesting was I found that the people who are super high up in their careers tended to actually be pretty nice. There's a lot of times like the upper middle management that were jerks, but by the time you get to like the CEO of these organizations or these artists who've achieved a lot of success, part of why they've had these long careers is that they're actually kind people. And I think this sort of long arc of justice is sort of becoming more and more true. And you see this obviously with Me Too and Harvey Weinstein, where I think there's generally sort of a sense of bad people are being rooted out of these creative fields. And so I was surprised by how kind so many of these people were. For example, I interviewed David Rubenstein, who's, he's a billionaire. He's on the board of 25 nonprofits, and he's the chair of Duke, the Kennedy Center, and the Smithsonian, And we're like having this interview, and he's like incredibly kind. He's incredibly curious, which I thought was really interesting. And people would come up to him, because he's kind of recognizable, he has a TV show now, and like he constantly would ask them questions. Right? And like even in our interview, I was trying to interview him, and he started asking me questions about like big data and analytics. And I was like, no, shut up. Like I want to interview you. So I thought the curiosity and the kindness thing was really interesting. The other thing is I talk in the book about I spent a day with the flavor team at Ben & Jerry's. which is like the best job in America, but weirdly they're all skinny, which I think is a big conspiracy. And that was a really fun experience, even as a lactose intolerant person. And anyway, there's some good stuff in the book about that, but that was just a really good experience because their process to create these wacky, zany flavors is actually highly, highly systematized. And their process at the end of the day is actually their product. They don't think about the ice cream as their product, but they think about their creative process as their product, and they're constantly refining that. So I thought that was really interesting.
So what do you consume that leads to your creativity?
So it's funny because working on this book, I was reading all this thousands of pages of peer-reviewed research on creativity. And so when I would go to the gym, I started having these really dorky aha moments about these goofy concepts in sociology and anthropology and these things that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And it sort of made sense, but I think for some reason when it comes to sort of celebrities or people we put on a pedestal, we're like, how did they come up with that? And it's like, well, Mozart literally played music since he was 3. Yeah, he thinks about this stuff. And so I think we sometimes forget the amount of preparation that goes into other people's creative success because we don't see it. And one of the themes in the book, generally, is that things we don't see with our own eyes as humans, we tend to explain away through sort of magic. And we say, oh, there's something mystical going on. Right? Inspiration is a great example, where we say, oh, there's this muses and stuff. And it's like, no, it's just subconscious. So that's one of the things that really struck me.
A lot of creatives are sort of tortured souls. The examples I'm coming up with are Anthony Bourdain, Kate Spade, Robin Williams. When you were interviewed, did you come across any of those where they have that flash of creative genius, but they might be suffering from depression or
Yeah, totally. So this is when I go into parenting advice as a 12-year-old. So here's my parenting advice. Okay, so here's what I found. Basically, I feel like I should have wrote an epilogue that was basically what to do for parents. 80% of these people who I interviewed come from pretty messed up homes, right? Either there was parental issues, there was abuse, they were poor, there was some form of chaos. 20% come from these highly, highly functional homes. So the reason why the dysfunctional homes drives a lot of overachievement is that if you're a kid who's going to literally go and watch hours of television, you're probably escaping something, right? And so there's something that's driving you to do that, which is why you see, I think, a lot of times that sort of tortured soul thing. On the other side, the 20% that were hyper-functional, the thing I found that was the common theme was literally, this is all it was generous feedback, right? When you have a 3-year-old and they paint something, I don't care if it's bad, I don't care if it's mediocre, just tell them it's great. Because by the time they're 5 and 7, if they've been told that they're great at painting for 4 years and they kept at it, they're going to become a pretty darn good 7-year-old at it. And so that's the thing you find when you actually look at these kids who come from really functional homes and become really successful creatively, is that they're encouraged through the hard parts. And this is why as adults it seems really hard to start a new creative skill. Even though there's all this science that it's pretty straightforward to develop talent, it just takes a lot of time. Basically, we see, well, look, it's so hard, and it's hard to motivate ourselves through that, right? But as a child, if your parents telling you you're the best thing ever and this is amazing, even if it's not, you're going to keep spending time on it, and eventually you're going to get pretty good at it, and more people will give you positive feedback, and there's this compounding effect. So give your kids too much positive energy. Cool. Thank you guys very much. We have some books for sale in the hallway during the break, so if you want to come say hi, get a signed book, just say hi. So thank you guys.
Great job.